So studying this kind of thing goes all the way back to Darwin. He noticed, you get these courtship displays which appear to have no survival value whatsoever. And in his book on the descent of man and sexual and selection in relation to sex, he proposed that these traits exist just merely because they are preferred by females, which is in one sense evidently true, but in another sense we still need, that doesn't really answer the question. Why do females prefer ludicrous, conspicuous, obviously not related to traits that are not related to survival? And that's been the subject of a great field of research for decades and decades and decades, in fact ever since Darwin. And I'm going to take you through the two major models of the evolution of secondary sexually selected traits, which are basically still the two main schools of thought today, although they've been kind of somewhat reconciled. They're not really mutually exclusive. And they are good genes models. We'll start with the runaway models. We'll start with runaway models, which are also known as the sexy son hypothesis. You might find that term used in the literature. And then there's the good genes models. So basically, to kind of summarise the entire lecture, the good genes models suppose that the trait in the male is actually related to his quality, and that these great male traits are effectively signalling, communicating a male's quality to a female. But the runaway models suggest that the trait can co-evolve with the preference in the female, and that creates a system of positive feedback which can spiral and lead to selection for ridiculous size traits, independently of any correlation with quality. Let's take you through these, and then there are some kind of sub-models within these and mechanisms that we're going to go through in the lecture as well. So we'll start with runaway models, or sexy son models, and this goes back to Ronald Fisher, who is a very famous mathematical biologist in the 1930s. His book, The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, is not worth a look because it's incredibly dense and involved, and you will meet him a lot in text about his book, but I've given you a link, but you just click on it and then scream and run away. But basically, you're lucky because I'm here to summarise what he said. He suggested that females are going to have variation in their preference for whatever they choose in males, and that can be completely arbitrary. Some females might, just by virtue of genetic mutations, have a preference for anything, for a bigger trait in a male. And that is going to, that's going to lead to, the offspring of those females are going to obviously carry a bigger trait themselves because their genes specify a bigger trait. So there's positive selection for a bigger trait from those females that prefer those males. But the thing is that there's also, the offspring are also going to carry the female's genes too, which carry the preference gene. So that's going to create more positive selection on females. But for all of those offspring, all the female offspring are going to prefer that trait too. And so that creates a cycle of positive feedback between females preferring the trait and their offspring having the trait, but their female offspring having more of a preference for that trait. And so over time, that positive feedback is going to lead to genetic linkage between the trait and the preference within the population. And that's going to create further positive feedback that's going to create more tightly link the trait and the preference. And over evolutionary time, the trait will basically increase in size. Let's say it's a long tail. You get females preferring long tails, and so their sons will have longer tails, but also their female offspring will carry a preference for longer tails. And the two will cycle and cycle and cycle, and the tails of males in the population will increase in size until it becomes a problem for viability. So they'll increase until it becomes deleterious to have any longer a tail, until you can't physically drag your tail around anymore. Until viability selection balances sexual selection. And one interesting property of this runaway, this is called the Fisherian runaway model. You'll hear this referred to as Fisherian runaway. The key property of this is that the initial female preference doesn't have to be linked to male quality. It can be completely arbitrary. It could be just females find it pretty. And that property of this model raises an important question, which is how does the initial female preference originate? Okay, so it could be arbitrary. It could be just like random mutation that a female arises that prefers longer tails. But there are two, among other minor ones, there are two fairly major theories about why females might carry a preference for a male trait. And firstly, we'll deal with this later, but firstly it could be that the trait honestly actually does reflect male quality. Good. And then the runaway process takes over. But an important one to mention is also something called sensory bias. And that is that, well, we'll deal with this now. And that's where females carry a preference for some other particular reason. So in zebra finches, Nancy Burley found that zebra finches prefer little white hats on males, even though the species doesn't have them. So if she glued little white hats onto males, she found that females will preferentially mate with those males, which is really interesting. I mean, she's also found exactly the same with leg bands. I think female zebra finches are not the brightest tools in the box, basically. But she found that female zebra finches will prefer to mate with males that have little hats. She supposed, or subsequent researchers have supposed, that females may have kind of innate preferences for certain shapes or colours, and that those, for any number of reasons. It could be that, for example, the species likes big red fruit to eat, and so females have their attention is directed towards big red things, and therefore if you paint a male with a big red mark, then that's going to get a female's attention just by virtue of the fact that it looks like some food, for example. And so males can evolve to manipulate female sensory systems and kind of grab attention based on a pre-existing bias that could exist for some completely other reason, like foraging. One good example, so a key prediction of that, a key prediction from this is the idea that the female preference will evolve before the male trait. So the male trait evolves in order to exploit a preference. So a good example of that is the work of Basolo. I should have linked that, sorry about that, I will do that in future. On swordtail fish. So swordtail fish, the males have this kind of really long kind of tail, quite unrelated, kind of way longer than their normal tail. The females prefer longer tails, and what Basolo et al. Did was to place tail length onto a phylogeny of swordtails and their relatives, their kind of ancestors, the platyfish. And platyfishes don't have these long tails, and swordtails kind of begin to get them until you get like the more derived members of that clade have really long ones. So Basolo put this onto a phylogeny and then conducted experiments with platyfishes up here by gluing tails onto the platyfish, and found that the female platyfish would prefer to mate with males which had glued on long tails, even though the species didn't have them. So this is nice evidence that the preference, so while the kind of the long tails evolved up here, the preference evolved all the way down there. God knows why they have. Have you any insight on why they have a preference for longer tails? Domino? No? Okay, cool. No, God knows why they have a preference for longer tails, but that preference evolved before the long tails actually appeared. And models of sensory exploitation have led to an interesting development of the runaway model, which has been termed a chase-away model, which is that imagine exactly the same model from that Fisher proposed, except in this case, this is Holland and Rice work. In this case, instead of the female preference coming along and an arbitrary female preference selecting for males, Holland and Rice suggested that males evolve a bigger trait to kind of overcome. Females are going to have a threshold level of stimulation before they respond. So below that level, they won't respond and they won't mate. Whereas above that level of stimulation, they'll go, oh, all right, then I'll mate with you. And males obviously get an advantage from stimulating over that level and mating. And so males will evolve a bigger trait to overcome this threshold for response. In which case the females can benefit by evolving a higher threshold for response in order to exert a bit more control over whom they mate with. In which case that selects for males to evolve an even bigger trait to overcome that higher response. And so you get a positive feedback cycle, not of trait and preference, but of trait for overcoming a stimulus versus the level of that, the threshold for responding to that stimulus. That's chase-away models. We'll put some beans on. It leads to what we call instead of leading to a positive feedback cycle and runaway selection, it leads to what we call an arms race. And we're going to meet arms races extensively in the next couple of lectures, because sexual selection is all about arms races, and we're going to meet them very soon. So we're going to put some beans on arms races.